In this video, we are going to show you how to replace your front lower control arm. Let's get started. The first thing you're going to want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle by the frame. Once you have the suspension hanging, you can continue on to removing all 6 of your 21mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now that we have the wheel off of here, let's move along to our outer tie rod end. We're going to remove the nut right up along the top using a 22mm socket. Once we have the nut off of there, we'll put it on a couple threads and then break the tie rod end free from the knuckle. Now for ours, it slid right out of the knuckle. If it didn't, you'd have to do like I said. Put the nut on there a couple threads, and then just give this a couple loving bonks and break it free. The nut's going to help prevent it from falling down on you. Now you can go ahead and pivot your knuckle and you can gain access to your 2 21mm headed caliper bolts. We'll remove the pair. Start with the top one. Go ahead and take it right out of there. Give the threading a quick inspection. After that, start it back in a couple threads and then fully remove the lower bolt. Now we're going to carefully pull the caliper off of the brake rotor. Once you have it off of there, just go ahead and give the pads a quick inspection. Make sure it doesn't look like they're worn at an angle. Assuming they look good, hang the caliper aside, putting no pressure on the flex hose. Remove your brake rotor, give it a quick inspection, set it aside. Now let's focus on the ABS wire. We're going to dismount it from the bracket that's closest to the flex hose. Continue following it up. You should find an area where the harness connects onto the frame. Go ahead and pop it free. Ours is already dislodged. The next thing you want to do is come over to this little squeeze tab where my index finger is. Carefully squeeze it in and separate the ABS wire. Once you have it disconnected, give it a quick check for corrosion. Assuming it looks good, set it aside. Let's take this ABS wire and just wrap it around the knuckle, being careful not to damage it in any way. Next, we're going to move along to the axle nut. You're going to find that you have a locking cotter pin. When you remove this, typically it's going to get damaged and it's a good idea to replace it. After that, remove the locking cap. Quick inspection. We'll use a 32mm socket to remove the axle nut. Use a hammer and punch directly in the center of the axle to break it free from the wheel bearing. Once you have movement, move along. Now let's move up to the top of the knuckle where the upper ball joint connects onto it. Remove your locking cotter pin and then move along to the nut. Something to keep in mind when you're removing the nut is that once you remove it, this could potentially break free from the ball joint and come down and potentially hurt you. So just keep that in mind. We'll use a 22mm socket to remove this nut. Once you have that nut off of there, give it a quick inspection and start it back on just a couple threads. Continue on by giving this area right here a loving bonk to break it free from the ball joint. At this point, we'll leave this in this position and move along to the lower ball joint. For the lower ball joint, you're going to find that you have an 18mm headed bolt that comes through from the front, through the knuckle, across the ball joint, and then all the way over to the other side. We'll use a 21mm socket to remove the nut and then remove the bolt. Continuing down at the lower ball joint, we're going to use a hammer and a pickle fork. We want to try to get in between the knuckle and the lower control arm, going around the ball joint stud. Try separating those two areas. Once it feels as though it breaks free, pause there and continue back up at that upper ball joint nut. Now at this point, the only thing holding the knuckle in the vehicle is the axle and the upper ball joint nut. I'm going to come right up here to the lower control arm, gently squeeze this together, and remove the nut. Keep in mind the knuckle will be a little bit heavy. Be careful not to hurt yourself. Now we'll start pulling this down. As we start pulling it towards us, you want to make sure you push the axle through the wheel bearing so you do not damage your axle. As I'm pulling this down, I'm going to be paying attention to the lower ball joint. You want to come at an angle and slide it down away from the axle and the ball joint at the same time. There's our knuckle. Quick inspection, set it aside. Now let's move along to our sway bar link. On the sway bar link, you're going to use a 19mm wrench. Come right down in between this area and try to hold onto the stud of the link. After that, we'll continue on to the 18mm headed nut. Remove that nut. We'll push that stud out of the lower control arm, and then we'll move up to the lower strut mounting bolt. To remove this bolt, we'll use a 19mm wrench on the rearward nut and a 19mm socket for the forward aspect of the bolt. Now that we have the nut off there, you just want to make sure that this bolt is broken free. I'll just give it a couple loving taps. As you can tell, it is broken free. I'm going to leave it in this position. Then we can move along to our inboard control arm bushing bolts. Now as we look at this area here, you can tell that it has an adjustment point on it. I went ahead and marked it with a crayon so I know exactly where it is when I have to go to put this back together. Now to remove each of these bolts, you're going to find that you have to use a 22mm socket for the bolt head, which is on the back side of this, and a 19mm socket to remove the nut. Once you have the nut off of there, you can continue on by removing the adjustment washer here. You want to make sure you remember which one goes where. Now the next thing you would want to do would be to drive this free from the control arm. Ours is frozen in the control arm itself, so I'm going to have to cut it. But generally you can just give it a couple loving bonks and then use a punch and push it all the way out. After that, do the exact same thing to the rearward bushing. Now we can move to the rearward bolt. As you can tell, I marked this with a crayon as well. Now for our mounting bolts, you're going to notice that I had to cut mine out of here. Typically, you can just go ahead and remove the nut, the outer housing there, and then of course remove the bolt with the cam adjuster on it. This is what it should look like right here. You want to give it a close inspection, make sure it's not rusted or rotted. Now that you have the forward one out, continue on to the rearward bushing and do the exact same thing. Keep in mind, once you have both of those out of there, the last thing holding this in place is just the pressure from the frame and of course that one bolt that you left in holding the strut to the control arm. Let's continue on by prying the control arm out of its place. You can either do that from under this area, in between the frame and the control arm, and push it free, or you can come from along the top and push it free from there. Whatever you do, keep in mind it's going to want to break free from here and swing down. Make sure it doesn't hurt you. Carefully remove your lower strut bolt. remove the control arm. There it is, friends. Continue on with a wire brush. You're going to want to make sure that you clean up the outer and the inner areas of each of the mounting points for the control arm. We'll do the same to the back one. The next thing you want to do is clean up the threads on your mounting hardware. After that, continue on by spraying down the shanked area with some Never Seez. It's also a good idea to use some thread locker on the threading. We'll slide the control arm into the proper position in the frame. Once you have it in there, continue on by sliding the bolts through from the rear towards the front. Once you have the bolt through, continue on putting on your other adjuster. Start on the mounting nut. Do the same thing to the rearward bushing. Now we can continue to the area where we have to put in the lower strut bolt. We'll line up the strut with the control arm. Once you get it close to lined up, continue on with your mounting bolt. Slide it through from the front towards the rear, then start on your mounting nut. The next thing you want to do is safely raise this control arm to the original ride height position. When you're doing this, be extremely careful. While you lift it, you could potentially shift the vehicle off of your jack stands. Once you have constant pressure underneath this control arm, continue on by snugging up your lower strut bolt. Once you have it snugged, continue on by torquing it to 99 foot-pounds. Follow that control arm to the inboard aspect where the control arm bushings are. Now I'm just going to go ahead and remove this nut real quick so we can have a look at the control arm bolt. You're going to find along the top area of the bolt, it has a flat area. When you have the flat area straight up, the cam adjuster is at the neutral position. If you had replaced these and you don't have your original markings anymore, it's a good idea to start this with the bolt facing just like this so the cam is in the neutral position. Of course, once you get everything all the way back together, you'll bring it to the alignment professional and they'll make sure that it's aligned properly. Once you have it snug, continue on to torquing it to 103 foot-pounds. Do the same thing to your rearward adjustment bolt. Once all that's tight, continue on by removing your lower control arm support. Continue on to the area where your sway bar link connects into the control arm. We'll take the stud and slide it right through the area of the control arm where it belongs. Once you have it in there, continue on by starting on your mounting nut by hand and then snug it up. Once it's snug, torque it to 62 foot-pounds. Time to pay attention to the axle. We want to make sure that the splined area right here is clean and free of any debris such as rust. Obviously, this is going to have to slide into the wheel bearing. You also have the threaded area right here. Make sure that's clean, and it's a good idea to put a little bit of thread locker on there when you're done. Now I'll just use some copper Never Seez on the splined area. Now the next thing we're going to have to do is grab onto that knuckle assembly. We're going to have to do a couple things all at once. We'll take that knuckle from an angle, try putting it onto the ball joint, and slide the axle through the wheel bearing at the same time. Once it starts coming together, we'll swing it up and hold it in position. Before you grab that knuckle, make sure you clean up the mounting bolt that holds the ball joint to the knuckle. The threading needs to be clean and free of any debris, and of course it's a good idea to use a little bit of copper never sees on the shanked area. Once you have the ball joint inside the knuckle, continue on with that bolt, slide it right on through. That'll hold the knuckle in place. Now we'll start on the lower ball joint nut from the backside. After that, you can continue on by snugging this up and then torque it to 70 foot-pounds. Now we can move along to the upper ball joint. We'll slide that into place in the knuckle. Start that nut on there and bottom it out. Once you have it bottomed out, continue torquing it to 58 foot-pounds. The next thing you want to do is pay attention to the slot on the mounting nut and the stud of the ball joint itself. The stud will have a hole going through it, and the nut has a whole bunch of slots. You need to make sure they line up. If it doesn't line up, continue tightening until the very next slot does. Once it does line up, continue on with your locking cotter pin. Let's continue on to installing our brake rotor. Commonly, to clean these, you might have to use some sort of sanding device. Once you have the hub clean, continue on to the back side of the rotor, the area that's going to mount directly against this. Once you have both of them clean, continue on with some copper never sees. Once you get that on there, continue on with a spacer of some sort and one of your lug nuts. What we want to do is hold the rotor in place. Now it's time to get our brake caliper in place. Make sure you clean the threads on your brake caliper mounting bolts. We'll slide this into place over the brake rotor and line up our mounting bolt holes. Once you have them lined up, start in both of the bolts, snug them up. Once you've done that, torque them to 155 foot-pounds. Now it's time for the ABS wire. Let's bring it between the upper control arm and the frame, connect it in. Listen for a click, give it a tug to make sure it's secure. Continuing on, you're going to want to make sure you put the push clip into its corresponding hole in the frame. Press it in so it's secure, and then move along down the line to the area with the bracket. We'll slide that right into place. Make sure it's completely secured. That looks good. Let's move to the outer tie rod end. Once you have the nut started, snug it up, torque it to 63 foot-pounds. Let's continue on to our axle nut. Screw this on by hand and bottom it out against the wheel bearing. The next thing we're going to have to do is torque this. To do that, I like to use a long pry bar. I'll come in between my studs and then up over my caliper bracket. That's going to hold this in place from turning clockwise. Once you have it snugged up, torque it to 101 foot-pounds. After it's torqued, put on your locking mechanism and your locking cotter pin. We'll slide it right on through. Peen it over so there's no way this nut can loosen up on its own while you're driving down the road. Now, once you feel as though you have everything together, continue on by double checking your work. You want to make sure you torqued everything along the way. Assuming you have, continue on back to your safety nut here. We'll remove that and the spacer. After that, you can continue on by putting on the wheel. Snug up all the lug nuts, get the wheel safely back on the ground, and then torque all of them to 98 foot-pounds. With the wheel safely back on the ground, we'll torque these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Okay friends, at this point we've fully installed our lower control arm. Go ahead and take it for a road test. Make sure you don't hear any funny noises and get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.